Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're very glad to have you with us for today's Anselm Exchange. Let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Travis Patel, and I am the Associate Director of University Engagement at Anselm House. If anyone is joining us today who's unfamiliar with us, Anselm House is a community of students, faculty, and staff, and a center for Christian study at the University of Minnesota, whose mission is to connect faith and knowledge with all of life. If you're hearing about us for the first time, please check out our website, anselmhouse.org, to learn more about our innovative campus presence. And do reach out. We'd love to help you or any Golden Gophers you know to get involved. We are really glad you're joining us today for this online forum and discussion. We're calling these online forums Anselm Exchanges. In each of these discussions, we hope to engage important theological, cultural, and ethical issues together in a spirit of mutual exchange and open dialogue. Of course, this would ideally be accomplished when we were together in each other's presence physically, preferably over a meal. But during our current crisis, as we've all had to do, we will have to make do with what we have and join each other virtually for this discussion. That said, I do hope that you have a good, delicious lunch in front of you and that you're ready to participate in the discussion. You can do so by submitting questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button below. And feel free there to interact by voting up other people's questions that you feel should be answered in our time of Q&A at the end of this discussion. Today's Anselm Exchange is on the topic of Christian ethics and pandemic ethics. If you're tuning in, you probably already have an acute sense of the fact that public health crises like the one we're currently experiencing raise a number of vexing and potentially troubling ethical issues. These questions are both individual and social in nature. For example, how are we to think about quarantine, isolation, and the restriction of individual freedom for the sake of public safety? How should we weigh the relevant costs of suppressed economic activity for the purpose of saving individual lives? How can we ethically distribute limited medical resources when there are not enough for everyone who needs them? Also, pandemics like COVID-19 raise broader issues about cultural values, priorities, and moral norms. To help us think through some of these issues today, I'm delighted to welcome our two panelists. First, Dr. John Tolbert is a general internist and associate professor of medicine and bioethics at Mayo Clinic, just about an hour and 15 minutes south of the Twin Cities here. He's also an affiliate faculty member at the University of Minnesota Center for Biomedical Ethics. Thanks for joining us, John. Our second panelist is Professor Kirk Allison. Kirk received his PhD from the University of Minnesota and now teaches in the Health Humanities faculty at the College of St. Scholastica and in the Theology Department at the University of St. Thomas. From 2006 to 2016, Kirk also directed the program in Human Rights and Health at the University of Minnesota. Hello, Kirk, and welcome.
Greetings, glad to be here.
Great. I think it looks like we lost John, so we're going to hope that he comes back. But if that's not the case, then we'll go ahead and start with Kirk here with our first question. So Kirk, I want to start off by noting a quotation from a recent Hastings Center report that I read called Ethical Framework for Healthcare Institutions Responding to the Novel Coronavirus. And this is what the quotation said. It says, and John's back, lovely. It says, while all healthcare resources are limited, public health emergencies may feature tragically limited resources that are insufficient to save lives that under normal conditions could be saved. There is, therefore, a basic tension between the patient-centered approach of clinical care under normal conditions and the public-centered approach of clinical care under emergency conditions. I wonder if we might start first with Kirk and then with John by just discussing this tension that they talk about in this report between maybe public health ethics and clinical ethics. And a more general way of putting the question would be, How do public health emergencies like this, and specifically our current coronavirus outbreak, challenge our settled moral norms and practices?
Good. Well, I think the key driver of sort of reframing how one acts and how one prioritizes is the word scarcity. A public health emergency or a disaster, the definition of a disaster is when the needs overwhelm the available resources. And hopefully in advance, through good planning, that situation will be mitigated so that when it occurs, there will be ways of maximizing the efficiency and the utility of the resources and actually directing them towards the patients and towards the populations that are most important or most at need and who can be helped by them in the most appropriate manner. There's a difference between public health ethics and medical ethics to some degree, in that public health ethics takes a population frame, a population view of health, and it's really looking at helping in a kind of utilitarian way, maximizing health across the broadest frames and across the broadest distinctions in the populations. Medical ethics tends to be looking at individual patients, maximizing welfare. And then there becomes this collision between the physician's intent and training to do that with the individual patient in a situation when there's not enough to go around for various patients who would all be worthy in normal conditions and should, in fact, in a just situation, receive really excellent care. And so there's a shifting, and this is something that I think John will unpack for us here a little more. But there's these situations for providers. There's this concept of moral distress, where you've been trained to act in a certain way, institutionally, socially, interpersonally, medically, and you are now in a situation where perhaps you can't do that because, let's say, you have 25 patients who have acute respiratory failure, but you only have 20 respirators, and what are you going to do, for example? And I think we can also think about normal moral practices in a little broader sense, also in terms of sort of the political order, the freedoms that we have, which include impinging the ability for the population to care for itself and to provision resources. Additionally, the behavior of people, the rationing, why people are suddenly rationing toilet paper when it doesn't make any sense, and deeper cultural practices that get impinged that have to do with the general well-being. And so there's a shift of expectations and frameworks, both for the people in the population coming to the hospital, let's say, and for the actual hard constraints that are there within the care setting.
Yeah, absolutely. John, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Kirk stated it well. In the usual state of affairs, we don't usually think about having to trade off the good of the individual for the good of the many, and yet here we find ourselves. And circumstances are always related, always have some sort of relationship with right action. And it's not that our fundamental notions of right action have changed, it's that the circumstances have changed. And a person doesn't have to be a moral relativist or a situation ethics person to realize that circumstances do constrain and sometimes restrict the range of plausible right actions. And that's exactly what we're facing here. In terms of the quote for the Hastings Center report, which I do think is a great resource, to put it in the terms of sort of more of sort of the wisdom of biblical traditions and things, to put it crassly, sort of the dilemma or the tension referenced in that quote could be phrased as simply as the dilemma between justice and mercy, where mercy tends to be the predominant orientation of a bedside caring clinician, and justice being the orientation of really, justice in its fullest sense and in biblical sense is much richer than how it gets talked about in contemporary political philosophy. Nevertheless, just as a nice sort of starting cartoon of how to think about it, it is that sort of what is the interface, or how might our notions, how might our circumstances constrain and impose certain kind of justice limitations on what sorts of mercy actions are allowable and foreseeably fair to deliver under the circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, John. I am struck by how under normal conditions, medicine for many people is articulated as a sort of covenantal act or role in relation to patients, right? And that is sort of individual care. And that's something that sort of covenantal approach gets brought up in medical ethics often. In the Hastings Center report and others, the very first ethical principle that's listed is fairness, which is ultimately a matter of justice, right? So even there, you get a shift in between those two patterns. I wonder if I could follow up with a question about sort of fairness and this idea. I think that probably for most of us, the clearest place where we see this playing out is the possibility of having to make difficult decisions about allocation of scarce medical resources, and in particular in places that have an overload in their ICUs of ventilator equipment and those sorts of things. I wonder if you could help us think through the ethics of triage, first John, and then maybe Kirk. In crisis situations, how do you begin to decide what are morally relevant criteria for making distinctions between people who may require access to ventilators, for example, and in the situation when you cannot give ventilators to all people, and help us, particularly maybe in your role as a clinician, understand how this actually looks in practice and who makes those sorts of decisions and how and what are the sort of the morally relevant aspects in formulating a policy.
Wow, that's a lot. First, I'm just gonna, because I was taken out of the video briefly, I'll just again preface my comments by saying I'm not speaking on behalf of my institution. I'm just hopefully a thoughtful conversation partner today. I think everybody agrees that you need some sort of process that moves beyond the whims of an individual. And that when we're faced with institutional and societal resource shortages, individuals should not be placed in, individual caring clinicians should not be put in a place where they have to decide between this patient and that patient. There should be criteria, there should be institutional processes whenever possible. And maybe unlike, for instance, a true combat zone, there are at least some anticipated procedures that at least give it a sense of due process, if not fairness. I think any schema, there's been a couple of major schemas sort of promulgated in the medical literature the last few weeks. Every schema is going to have flaws. But having a schema, I think having some strategy or criteria to implement these, implement some sense of what do we care about as a society, how do we protect our neighbors, and yet acknowledge the fact that not everybody can get every piece of technology. I think that's a reality. So every schema is necessary. Schemas are necessary. Every schema is imperfect. Then you have to ask yourself what sort of schemas then are most reflective of our highest values. And there it gets really sticky, right? So is it number of lives saved? Is it number of life years extended for a society as a whole?
What's the difference between those, John, just for those who are tuning in who maybe have never...
So you can imagine, so the number of lives saved basically ignores the longevity of the person being rescued, right? So if I decide, if I decide to take someone who's already, say, in hospice and decide to put them on a ventilator, I might be able to extend their life for some time, right? Though it gets to a point where even those kind of patients probably never will come off a ventilator. But as opposed to, that's sort of counting lives, as opposed to counting sort of life, potential years of life saved, where you, even if you know, where a middle-aged or someone in their 20s person would always say be prioritized in the queue above, say, a retiree, because even a 15% chance of living 70 years more versus a 20% chance of living 10 years more is always going to favor the 20-year-old, right? So those are the kind of trade-offs that people are arguing about. And I'm not going to sort of assert one particular position on that. I think those are the anguished, difficult choices of these schemas, and it speaks to the imperfection of them. I mean, none of these schemas, because they're so instrumental, and they're treating sort of kind of the image of God in individuals as sort of pawns in a game. They're never going to feel good. There's going to be a moral remainder in all of this, and hopefully with a lot of confession and soul searching and humility and grace, we'll come to the other side of it and be able to be smarter about this. But I think having these frameworks are important and are necessary, and they speak to the fact that really the scriptures even speak of the importance of both justice and mercy, and that we need to do right by our neighbors as best we can, even if imperfectly.
Kirk, do you want to amplify any of those points or add to that?
Yeah, sure. I have a couple of slides that may be helpful, and I'm going to have to bring it up to the current one. But the sort of the purpose of this slide here is just to contextualize this question of what is our attitude in terms of planning and response, in terms of who counts as vulnerable, and in terms of sort of both where maybe you might say mercy and justice meet. So here we have the 1911-1917 flu and tuberculosis mortality curve, and it's this U-shaped curve that's very familiar. But then there was the 1918 pandemic, and you have this sort of W curve. And what you see is that very young kids were affected, but also people in the prime of life and who were in their 30s, a lot of pregnant women, for example. And there's sort of a strange biographical note to this, because my paternal grandfather's first wife, Melinda, was killed by that flu. And she was about 30 years old or 32. And he remarried, and my dad was born of the second marriage. And so I'm in sort of the genealogy, however these things work. Maybe I'd be a locus of consciousness somewhere else. But I'm sort of here because of the 1918 flu in a genealogical sense. And then you have this, well, here you have the COVID-19. This is data from Korea. And what you see about the risk profile is that the people who are at risk, here's the 80 years old, 70 years old, 60 years old. These are the people who are going to be needing the ventilators, right? And so in this case, and there's some young people too that have some kind of bad outcomes, but in this case, all of the people that are going to be most at need are going to be on that upper end of the age spectrum, right? In which, if you're having expected life years and these sorts of things, are going to have less. And so one of the things to think about is how this context impacts that. One thinks also, John mentioned impairments and these measurements. There's disability adjusted life years. If a person uses a wheelchair on a disability adjusted life year, if you count using a wheelchair as half, from 0 to 1, it counts as half, and you live 50 years and you have 25 qualities, that person is always going to lose out. They're always going to have this deficit in that kind of a calculus. And so I think what we're needing to do is sort of reframe things to the situation, but also realize what the biases are. And there's this article by your old colleague, Travis, Mary Faith Marshall, and Deb DeBruyne over at the U of M, and Joan, and about social justice. And they made this comment in their study about in Minnesota when we had H1N1, 31% of the hospitalized were minority patients, and they only make up 11% of the population. And sort of what the point of that is that health disparities that are already in advance of a pandemic, that are already in advance of public health emergency, are sometimes socially structured. And then those people are sort of pre-sorted towards health outcomes in a way, in the social structuring of the population in various ways. And then they come to the door of the hospital, and then they're said, well, guess what? You don't meet the criterion for this kind of treatment. And so one of the questions is, how do we both help people before a pandemic so that their health is better, but do we take this into account, the fact that they may be already disadvantaged in some way, in a systematic sort of way, and that we should look at. And then the last point I'll make on this is just with the ventilator, if there's not a ventilator to your mother, we try to come up with some sort of a rational, usable, functional system. And as John mentions, everything is imperfect. But I think we get into trouble if we start thinking that, quote, lifeboat ethics is really delivering justice. And we shouldn't act like that. We shouldn't pretend that it may be a tragedy, and whatever it is. But I think we need to recognize that, no, the person isn't getting their due, but you're really making the best within a bad situation, given the resource constraints at hand, and making prudential judgments and trying to love your neighbor as best you can in the midst of all of that. And particularly that the rules are sort of set up in advance is really important. And one of the things that Mary Faith did and Joan was a lot of times one way of doing this is by public input in advance and you do a community meeting. You can do it on the Oregon, there's a public engagement model that Greg Fowler developed and others. And you can ask the community, what are your priorities if you're in this situation? And some people who are older, they would say, well, if you have to choose between myself and a mother who's 35 that has 4 kids, then I really want the mother to have it. I'll take my chances, and to get some community input in advance in terms of the priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. John, I wonder if I could switch gears and just have you answer this next question briefly. It has to do with sort of the ethics of responsibilities within roles. And I'm thinking particularly about the physicians that I know and nurses as well. My wife is a nurse, and especially in the situation where we have lack of sort of personal protective equipment as well, and people asking hard questions. One of those questions is about sort of the duty to care and how we think about the duty to care in relation to other duties we have. And I know you do some medical education. I wonder if some of your students are asking about this and what you say to them.
Well, I think this pandemic has been a great case study in how we're sorting through what we understand to be professional obligation. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, it's reinvigorated a really great conversation about the nobility of healthcare and the ability of everyday people doing really routine jobs to be thought of and think of their job as a big deal. Mm-hmm. Even if it feels routine and mundane, and even if, day to day kind of the drudgery and burnout and moral distress is sort of a huge burden to bear. We've just seen an incredible resurgence in the nobility of the sense of calling, which I think is really great. We've also obviously seen the fracture points where it feels like the institutional obligations to care for workers get strained and stretched in terms of getting creative about personal protective gear. It reminded me of a summer I spent in West Africa, where everybody's used to rewashing gowns and masks all the time. And the ventilators are nothing other than a very strong Nigerian going like this on a bag, mm-hmm. Over an endotracheal tube. So a lot of this relates to our the luxury and decadence of American sort of healthcare that we so easily and flippantly burn through a lot of resources all the time. And when we're actually faced in times of constriction, it's sort of jarring. But to the question of duty to care, I think that a duty to care is one of the, I don't really think about it as a duty to care. I actually think about it as sort of a coupled corollary privilege and obligation. And I don't know philosophically what the difference between an obligation and a duty is, but to me, duties speak of rights. And I don't really think of healthcare in those terms, not because it can't be and not because it may not ought to be from a societal level, but I don't think about my role as a clinician as a duty. I think of it as an obligation that I've chosen. And a set of obligations gravely chosen at times, and as you mentioned, covenantally chosen for many of us, that entails certain kinds of risks that I do take very seriously. Now, I would also say that the more power and the more esteem, the more firm, I guess, the duty would be, if you want to call it a duty. So I would say physicians with qualifications, skills, and active license who walk off the job because they don't want to take the risks, despite having appropriate protective gear, I don't have a lot of compassion for those people, right? Unless they've got a chronic illness, unless they've got a dying spouse, unless there's some other acute mitigating circumstance. I just you know, the general sort of, I didn't sign up for this level of risk kind of thing. I can imagine circumstances where that could be relevant. I just don't feel like in most circumstances, that's the way to go. I think it's like when the going gets tough, I'm no longer a Marine, right? Like, come on.
Yeah.
But there are these important institutional obligations, as you mentioned. And would there be circumstances where physicians or nurses could or should sort of protest having insufficient protection? I could imagine that. But for the sake of getting back on the battlefield, so to speak, not for the sake of continuing to draw a paycheck while not doing, risky work.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is that the duties and obligations that arise are serious, but not absolute. And they shouldn't be set aside lightly. And most positions, I think you'd probably agree, don't. And we're seeing people rise up, which is partly why we're sort of recognizing the nobility in that. Kirk, I wonder if I could shift gears to you as well and ask you a question about a conversation that's going on right now about the sort of relative value of resource allocation and also sort of our public health policies and their implications broader in society. So the question is about the economic impacts of suppressed sort of movement and the current social distancing policies we have. We know that nearly 10 million people have filed for unemployment claims in the last 2 weeks. We know that the stock market recently dropped its greatest plunge in a single day since 1987. We're hopeful that sort of as this wraps up, that the conditions are in place for a bounce back economically, but people are wondering, is it sort of all worth it? How do we begin to think about those, balancing the economic impacts with the sort of public health impacts? I wonder if you might have some guidance for us in that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I guess the way I'd like to frame it more broadly is to say that the economic impacts are part of the public health impacts. In other words, I don't want to make a dichotomy between the two. And here's a little bit, this might be helpful to think about this in this context. So there's this famous WHO definition of health, which is sort of idealized and asymptotic, and by it, nobody is healthy more than 2 hours a day, where health is a state of complete, right? Physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity, okay? Now, the main focus that we have right now in a pandemic situation is the presence of disease and infirmity in terms of considering health. It's not so much the physical, well, it is a physical, but what about mental and social well-being? This is a broader view, and I think what we need to do is understand that there's costs of interventions, both socially and from a medical point of view in terms of allocations. And here's thinking about, you know, Christian ethics and economics and COVID-19 and maybe how to start to think about this. The first thing I want to offer is that there's pathogen morbidity and mortality, and that's real. And the risk factors, you know, you saw how the curve was according to age and so forth, but there's also policy morbidity and mortality, okay? And that is also real. And so, and I want to say that neither one or the other is more real than the other. Now, if you're a medical person, you're going to be focusing on this, right? And you're not going to be focusing so much on this. If you're a governor or maybe a president or something else, a mayor, you're going to be maybe looking at both of these. So what are the costs of social, I hate this term social distancing. I much prefer physical distancing because I think some people sort of, an externality is sort of social isolation of people. I like social connectedness and physical distance. But, you know, what are some real costs of this social connectedness and the shutting down of everything, except for the supermarkets and the gas stations and the Home Depot? Well, you have lots of people that are lapsing back into addiction because they're not making it into meetings. And, you know, Al-Anon meetings, Alcohol Anonymous, addiction support meetings, things like this. And those people, a number of them are going to die due to overdoses due to these closed meetings. There is real and there is dead as a COVID-19 person dying of acute respiratory failure. And there's people who are losing businesses who may commit suicide, who will see their entire life substance go down the drain. And those people are just as real and are just as dead as a person dying in the acute care setting. And so what I want to say is that there are real costs that are being externalized upon the population by a certain kind of approach and by prudential judgments that are being made by governors and differently in different states and in different countries. And here's an example where you have 3 different countries. You have Norway, Sweden, and the United States, and we're all dealing with the same pandemic, but we're doing it somewhat differently here. So with Norway, they have a smaller population, 5.4 million. Their hospitality centers, they have this 1 meter rule, not the 6 feet rule. And they've shut down a number of things like sporting events, sport activities of certain kinds. And they've set up rules, but they're much less restrictive than here. And they have about, this was a couple of days ago, 5,370 cases, with the first one starting on February 26th. Now with Sweden, you have double the population. They have, you know, no more than 50 people gathering. We have no more than 10 and keep far away. Arm's length, they had on the 2nd or the 4th of February, they had their first case, and they have actually a lower case rate than here. We're in an economic lockdown, and we have, you know, somewhat similar rates. But clearly there's much less economic disruption of lives here and somewhat more, but less than the United States and what we have in Minnesota. So I think the question of the language about, you know, is the cure worse than the disease, or at what point are these costs sort of balancing out in a way, is a really serious thing we have to think about. And we also have to think about the kinds of people. We are all privileged, hands-on, and maybe blue collar, white collar. I mean, John's hands-on. I'm at a computer terminal all the time. We're very privileged, right? And so white collar workers, we continue to work at home, but the people that are having their businesses closed that are not having this, of course, we're spending trillions of dollars in ways that may be wise or not, or who cares? You know, let's just give people money to help them out. That may be really a good thing to do for a while, but it's not sustainable. And again, I go back to my example of people in abuse groups. I just think of the people that are semi-homeless. And you could say, well, they could do, you know, can't you do a groups online, you know, support groups with Zoom? Well, yeah, you can, but a lot of those people don't have computers. And where do people that are semi-homeless go to use the computer? They go to the library, and those libraries are all closed. So even if you have an online group, you know, they're not going to be able to do it. So I think in terms of this that we have to think of the policy morbidity and mortality and take a serious look at the comparative models and make very strong prudential judgments on this.
Great. I want to get in some of the questions from the people who are viewing from home or from wherever they are. The first one, there's a couple that are kind of linked, and so I'm going to try to link them so we can get them both in at once. The first one is about establishing criteria for allocating the resources, and I think we've recognized that it's tragic. And the question is about, does it necessarily contradict an affirmation that all human life has dignity, regardless of the quality of life or remaining quantity of life that it has? And I think it's about, basically, it pushes into this question about life years and quality of life judgments and its relation to our notion of equality of human dignity. And there's another question from Leif Soldberg, who's a sort of participant in our community, who talks about basically the difficult of the timescale of this issue when patients present themselves one at a time, but you know and anticipate that there will be a surge and a shortage. And the question is about, what do you do when you have somebody presenting who would be a low priority ventilator allocation if there already was a shortage, but there isn't a shortage yet, but we anticipate in the next couple of days there will be. So somebody comes in who maybe, like you said, John, is coming from a hospice and is going to stay on the ventilator or maybe not make it through. How do you think about that? And I have read a lot of the different ethical guidelines talk about the need to take people off of ventilators who are not improving and who don't seem like they are going to improve in order to reallocate ventilators. Is that something we can do while still affirming the equality of human dignity? I'll let either of you answer that.
Well, I guess I'll take a stab, but John, would you like to go first? This is like playing chicken, right? Who's gonna? Well, I think the question of dignity is what does it mean to love this person in this context, from a Christian point of view, and from and what does it mean to have a certain sort of equity frame that is functional in this context given the resource constraints. Now, if your mother was on the ventilator and somebody told and she texts or whatever and said, I think they're taking me off the ventilator to give it to somebody else, that's a horrific thing. On an interpersonal level, it's going to have a huge impact in terms of trust of the healthcare system down the line. There's going to be big externalities to that. So you can either have a rule, if you're on it, then you keep it. So, and the person who comes through the door, if they have the need and they can be helped with that, then we're going to go with that or not. But it's, again, it's this question of sort of a defensible practical schema versus what's really just. And John is the clinician. I'm not, so it's easy for me to talk. But my predilection is if that person shows up and they can be objectively helped by this ventilator, and they just happen to be, well, most people are going to be older here. I'm more given to let them have that resource. And in fact, having that resource for that amount of time, they might actually have an outcome where they're able to bridge over to not needing that resource. John, I'll pass the ball to you, lateral here, rugby style.
So I think that the impetus for the question is really preserving and upholding the dignity of individuals in a time when we can't provide all potential technological services that might be somehow demonstrative of that affirmation. And I think inevitably with whatever schema you've got, there's still going to have to be prudence and judgment and discernment. And we might get it wrong. We might get it wrong individually. We might get it wrong collectively. And on the back end of this, we will pray for the grace to repent and move forward. I don't think that a first come, first serve, when you have a foreseeable impending sort of calamity, is a sufficient schema. Now, when you switch over from sort of more or less usual standards to crisis standards, is its own interesting switch. What does that look like organizationally? What happens to the patient who shows up immediately when that switch happens, right? Those are interesting sort of, angels on the pin of a needle kind of questions. To me, I think we've got to have schemas that we think are defensible, that take our neighbors seriously, that honor existing inequities and try not to exacerbate those, and if anything, sort of mitigate them whenever possible. But believe that there might need to be something beyond a first come, first serve in order to be at least wise as best we can. I don't think there's an alternative to having to have some scheme. And I actually, I worry a little bit too, that at least for people of faith, getting too worried about which schema about ventilator allocation kind of gets us off our game. Because I think historically the church is at its best when it says that non-abandonment and accompanying the dying to their final end is our mission. The hospitals and risky church-based outreach to the most vulnerable with communicable diseases did not happen after ventilators were instantiated, right? Like the church has been doing this for a really long time. Under very risky circumstances. And I just hope that, as important as schemas are, that we don't forget that there might need to be some radical thinking about what does it mean to attend the dying while they're dying, rather than what does it mean to come up with the perfect dignity affirming ventilator allocation activity. That, in my opinion, is more crucial. How do we make sure that hospital policies create space for nobody dies alone, right? What does that look like? I don't hear those conversations happening, or at least they're not the dominant ethics conversation in the national media. And I think that that's where people of faith can have a countercultural voice to say, look, I get your schemas, whatever, I'm going to be a citizen, I will submit. I won't be I won't be demanding and ask for more than I deserve, but let's take seriously accompanying the dying.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really nice point, John. And it just reminds me that that covenantal aspect for physicians doesn't go away, right? And the duty to care does not always mean the duty to cure, and that there are other ways to attend and to socially accompany those who, for tragic reasons, don't have access. So I think you're right to refocus our attention in that way. One of the questions that came in sort of touches on this. It asks, since patients may not have visitors in our current sort of setup, what's the provider's role in comforting patients and family members, especially when they're at their end of life? And then a correlated question is sort of, how can the church sort of be present to the dying in this situation? I don't know if you have any sort of examples of things that you've seen this done well, but where does that sort of comfort and solace possibly come from?
Yeah, so one of the things that's tricky about this is when you're dealing with the communicable disease pandemic, because you have the situation of isolation and quarantine and the risk of transmission. And so you see this now, everybody's probably seen a picture of somebody outside of an assisted living center talking to their grandmother standing outside on the phone outside the window, and you're having that. So the people that are going to be there, are they going to have personal protective equipment? Are they going to be the official workers of the church? What about, or of the hospital? What about family members? Because the normal thing, if your family member is dying, and you can't do anything more procedurally, technically to help preserve their life, then they want to spend that time with that person. And now that's a real difficulty. But what John was saying is really so important, and it's actually in the roots of the Christian interception, or the crossing with the issue of pandemic historically. The Christian community actually made its mark in the Roman Empire before 313 by their care of people during the epidemics. There were two. There was the plague of Galen, or sometimes called the Antonine plague, in 160, that may well have been smallpox, and then the plague of Cyprian in 251, which was probably some sort of a hemorrhagic fever. And what was notable was that the Christians were caring for everybody. They were caring for the pagans, they were caring for the Christians. And Dionysius of Alexandria has a very interesting a description of this, and the impact that it had on the whole culture. And in fact, later Julian was an emperor who was an opponent of the Christians, who was saying, you know, these pious Galileans are the ones who are caring for the pagan, for our people, much better than we are. And it was a costly care. And in fact, with the plague of Cyprian, there's this description of the people caring for them, washing the bodies and all of this. And it turns out one of the best theses about it is it was probably a hemorrhagic fever, maybe something like Ebola, and a lot of those people died. The other was smallpox, and a lot of those people died. And it was in a period where there was real martyrdom going on from the Roman persecution. And Cyprian was actually killed eventually a few years later. And it transformed the culture, and it transformed the people that were and it helped the people that were in their most emergent things. So there is this description by Dionysius saying that it was almost like a substitutionary, almost sort of martyrdom that was being assumed by the Christians out of the love of their neighbor. Now, we don't want to have a hemorrhagic fever, you know, whereas the description of the pagans so called was that they just left their sick in the middle of the street and ran. And in fact, the Galen, the Roman physician, left Rome. He took a boat and he went all the way past Greece, all the way to Asia Minor, and just sat it out. So this kind of costly care that has some cost and maybe risk to yourself is very central to the Christian message of sort of kenosis, emptying yourself and loving your neighbor in a powerful way. John, you can probably add something to that.
I just want to add, there's a great blog post by Brad Littlejohn on Mere Orthodoxy about the appropriate role of sort of a Christian response to social distancing and things. Because I want to say, on the one hand, it's perfectly appropriate for all of us to submit to the rightful rulers and the magistrates to enforce our moment, and at the same time be willing to give up what in my case is a very suburban white middle-aged sense of risk tolerance to potentially be more courageous than I ever imagined. And both submitting as well as being willing to enrich our moral vocabulary of what care really is, and to take sort of holy risks, and to be a little bit questioning about, well, isn't there a way to care for these people and wear personal protective equipment? And is there a high touch way to do this? I think those are the questions we should be asking.
So one of the questions that we've recently got goes back to an earlier question that I was going to ask anyway. So that's nice when that happens. And the question is basically about how Christians and Christianity can reframe our conversations. This one talks about reframing the conversation to help the broader public see what's at stake in describing ethical quandaries that seek to address the various concerns related to the common good. But there are other ways that sort of the Christian framework or orientation maybe reframes our current moment in ways that might be surprising to people who don't share our faith. I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about about that sort of relationship between the Christian framework and broader frameworks that you are more likely to encounter right now.
Well, the beginning with the whole anthropology of who is a human being is rooted in relationship, and what's the meaning of meaning? It's relationships at every level, whether it's math, whether it's interpersonal, whether it's medical, is that we are bringing to the center. I think this is an opportunity, as well as being a huge stressor. It's an opportunity for reframing, reprioritizing what's the core of being in a community, and not just in a society for each other, and to root that within the Christian narrative also of redemption, of mercy, and of course issues of justice. There's just show one last slide here. There is in Cyprian's De Mortalite, on mortality, it's a sermon, and it's a great sermon, and I hope you all look it up. He says, what a great thing it is, and how pertinent and necessary that pestilence and plague, which seem so horrible and deadly, searches out the righteousness of each one, examines the minds of the human race, not just the Christians, but of the human race, to see whether they who are in health tend the sick, love the kindred, pity the servant, whether physicians do not forsake their beseeching patients, whether the fierce suppress their violence, the rapacious quench their avarice, and whether the ones who are dear and have riches and don't have heirs, leave it to the poor or leave it to do some good. And so in a way, it's a bit of a cultural crucible in which the word of the gospel and the reality of the importance and the primacy of relationships is really important. And I've just noticed on the street that people at a distance who I see walking their dogs, we're actually talking to each other. We're actually saying, how are you really doing? And there's this little dance in the grocery store of, not running into people or whatever. But people are being cognizant of their space and of their impact on other people in a way in which some really good things can happen if attention is paid to this, and sort of as a kind of spiritual discipline, and as a kind of social difference, and a kind of cultural discipline for even people that aren't personally Christians, will be moved more into this ethos of the primacy of relationship and of love for the neighbor. And I think it's a huge opportunity, as well as a huge inconvenience, while at the same time we're being really aware that there are people who are going to be super suffering financially. And, maybe you should have an extra bag of rice or something in your car when you run into somebody and they're doing really badly. You can say, hey, you can have this. You can, can I help you? Here's $50 or whatever it is. This is a huge moment, I think, for the culture, because it's so decentering everywhere, from, you mentioned the stock market, to all sorts of ways that people get their identity. It's a wonderful moment that I think so much redemption in life can flow from this wound that so many people are beginning to suffer.
So just a clarifying question, Kirk, on this slide that you've given us, when it says that pestilence and plague searches out the righteousness of each one, he's not suggesting that only the righteous are the ones who don't suffer. He's saying that because we're all suffering in this way, all these sort of virtues and characteristics of each person sort of come up to the surface in our response to the suffering. Yeah. Is that what he's saying?
Absolutely. And there's a previous quote on another slide earlier in which he asks the questions, some Christians are asking, why are we suffering? And of course they were under persecution, where if people were getting killed now and again on a regular basis. But he's saying, well, we're incarnate human beings. We're in the flesh. It's common to us, sickness, shipwreck, enemy comes in and ransacks the village. We all suffer commonly, just like everybody else in the body. We're not exempt in any way. I mean, there may be extraordinary circumstances where extraordinary grace is given and you're given sort of a pass on something. But he says, don't worry about it. Don't ask about it. This is common to the humanity, and we're part of common humanity. And then the flip side of it is this: it's not just the Christians that are being interrogated a little bit about this, but the searching out of the righteousness of everybody. You know, the goodwill and the intention and the sacrifice of all people who care for their neighbor from whatever frame they're coming from. So it's both being in the same boat with everybody else and not being special, and also being tried and sort of having a mirror put up to your face because the whole usual routine has been interrupted, and you have no choice but to do this because you can't go back to your usual routine to fill your time. Yeah. And so it's a huge opportunity, I think, and can be very graced.
So one of the things you mentioned that seems immediately relevant is that view of suffering and as an occasion for possible good. And some people would talk about redemptive suffering or redemption and suffering in their relationship. And that's not a sort of common cultural framework, but it's one that's on the edges of what you're saying. John, I wonder in our last few minutes if you might add to that sort of question about that reframing that might happen.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the moments like this show us the inadequacy of our very modern mindset that affects Christians as much as non-Christians. I on my rereading list this month was How Not to Be Secular by James K. A. Smith. And I think if we can take this moment to wonder out loud, how are we sort of haunted by our notions of meaning and longing by this, instead of entrenching ourselves in the illusion of control and production and everything that sort of a market economy tends to sort of drive us to, then I think we're opening ourselves up to the possibility that the suffering that we're seeing everywhere could be tethered to something bigger, and meaning that I don't think we can fully sort of prescribe or preach or hand out in a tract, but we can hope for.
Yeah, I think that the notion of hope is apt one to end on. You know, we are in a time when we are likely to feel a lot of these questions get pressed even more acutely than we've felt them already before we come out the other side. And I think you've both done us a great service in giving us some frameworks for thinking through that. And so I appreciate both of you and your contribution to our discussion today. Thank you for helping us think through those things. I want to say a quick word to everybody else who's watching before we in the broadcast here. I just want to say thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. Maybe we'll be able to find an avenue to follow up on some of them and engage them. I do invite you to, if you're not already done so, go to our website, anselmhouse.org, just to explore the types of things we have coming up. We do have one Anselm Exchange that touches on the theme of this particular conversation. In a couple weeks, we're going to have a discussion on, it's called Faithful Presence, Spiritual Care, and Chaplaincy in Extraordinary Times. And it touches on some of the problems we have mentioned about how do you provide care spiritually and physically in crisis situations. And we'll be joined in that conversation by Paul Galchit, who's a research chaplain at the University of Minnesota, Kelly Bergeson, who is a spiritual care director at an elder care facility here in the Twin Cities, and Michael Balboni, who's a pastor and chaplain and scholar in Boston at Harvard and at Park Street Church. And so really looking forward to that discussion. Hope you will join it. I believe we'll have a link for you if you want to click on that, or just look at our website and find it there. Thank you all. Have a great and wonderful rest of your day, and God bless.
Thank you.